Again, good morning, everyone. Thank you again. My name is Josh Sylvester. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations. Thank you again for joining us for the second installment of our Corsair Chat series on the Russian war in Ukraine with UMass Dartmouth Professor of History Brian Glyn Williams. Dr. Williams has been a professor of history at UMass Dartmouth since 2001. He has traveled the world as an academic researcher and a U.S. military and CIA advisor seeking to understand the nature of conflicts. Much of his time has been spent in Afghanistan, working alongside tribal groups to resist Taliban rule. His work with the Afghan warlord, General Dostum, was featured in 12 Strong, a recent movie starring Chris Hemsworth. Dr. Williams has also spent considerable time in Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia, and has authored 3 books on this area of the world. Since the first chat, Professor Williams co-authored one of the most extensive history-based analyses of the war to date. The essay, Has Putin Heeded the Warnings from the History of Urban Warfare, was posted on the History News Network and was written with former UMass D history student Aaron Raleigh. The link to the article is going to be available in the chat. We definitely encourage you to click on that and give it a read. As discussed in our first chat, Professor Williams successfully predicted that Russia would have a very difficult time occupying Ukraine, and that they would respond with indiscriminate force, killing tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. After Professor Williams presents the latest updates on the war, he will take questions from the group. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. You can also put them in at any time your question comes up. Last time we had several hundred questions. We couldn't get to them all, and we'll do our best today to get to as many as possible. So without further ado, Professor Williams, welcome. Good to see you again.
Hey, thanks, Josh, and thanks for all you've done to make this happen. Also, thanks to Ryan Merrill in charge of public relations, Dean Hickey, and also my wonderful dean, Paul Atine, and also my chairman, Mark Santow, who gave me the chance to essentially immerse myself, 8-9 hours a day, trying to focus on this war. It gives me no pleasure being right when it comes to my prediction that the Russians would storm into Ukraine with these heavy tank columns and artillery and aircraft, and they would have a difficult time occupying the country. And also, I predicted that they would make the Ukrainian people pay a heavy price in blood for resisting them. We've now seen, I think in the city of Mariupol in the south, which is the most destroyed city on the planet right now, 5,000 Ukrainians have been killed. Sadly, over 300 were killed in a Russian strike on a big theater that had the word "Deche," children, written outside of it. And also, of course, we've seen tragically over the course of the last week, these stunning and horrific images coming out of the Kiev neighborhood of Bucha, where men, women, children have been tortured, burnt alive, and massacred in the hundreds, if not thousands. So the Russians are really acting like war criminals. I think Biden was right to call Putin a butcher and a war criminal. And I think it's remarkable that he has united both Republicans and the Democrats against him. We had some sort of pro-Trump sympathy in the country. That seems to have ended. And Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said someone needs to take this guy out. So things have changed drastically since we last spoke. These truly are extraordinary times we're living through. You couldn't have seen this sort of thing unless you lived through World War II. And the most important news, I think the biggest, most pivotal turning point in the war was the fact that recently the Russians marched down from the country of Belarus, which is north of Ukraine, with this giant column. They created a salient, almost like a peninsula, into Ukraine, and tried decapitating the Zelensky government, this democratically elected government, and overthrowing it, destroying its democracy, and bringing Ukrainians into their country. And it could have gone that way. We could have seen Zelensky executed. We could have seen this democracy destroyed, and we could have seen it forever conquered by Russia. These things happen. We saw Taliban destroy democracy in Afghanistan in August. So countries can be lost forever. But the Ukrainians fought back. And that's the big story. The Ukrainians have won the first phase of this war. They have decisively repulsed this giant Russian armored thrust on their capital. And no one saw this coming. I expected them to be repulsed in the city, in urban warfare. I didn't think the Kievans, the Ukrainians, would be able to keep the Russians from actually penetrating the city. All they got into was the neighborhoods. And this is the amazing story of the day. To put it in sort of a UMass Dartmouth terms, this would be like our amazing football team, the Corsairs, going up against the New England Patriots, NFL football team in the Super Bowl, and winning in the first round, or perhaps the first quarter. We don't know how long this war is going to go on. But thus far, at least in one front, Ukrainians have stunned the West, which didn't believe they could do this. And certainly they've stunned and shocked Putin, who really underestimated the fighting mettle and desire to maintain their freedoms of the Ukrainians. So at the end of last month and the beginning of this month, the Russians, in defeat, rolled back their troops, and we've seen all sorts of destruction. Many tank columns of Russians that were blown up. These Javelin anti-tank missiles have proven to be a real game changer. We've shipped $2.3 billion worth of weapons to the Ukrainians since the war began. This is much more money and weapons than we ever sent to the Mujahideen, the rebel Afghans during the Afghan war. So this really has given them a fighting chance. If you read my article, there's these videos, one featuring a Russian tank column coming through from the city of Brovary and just being annihilated by these Ukrainians. All over Russia, this is happening. These giant tank columns of T-72 tanks, T-92 tanks, they're coming in and being blown to pieces by these Ukrainians who've been armed with these Javelin anti-tank missiles. And these are the most advanced anti-tank missile system in the world. They fly up over the top of the tank and go into the weakly armored top, the turret, and blow them up. So the Russians have been massacred. According to NATO, they may have lost 15,000 troops since the war began. To put that in perspective, we fought 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, 20 years in these two countries, and we lost 4,500 in Iraq and 2,200 in Afghanistan. So they lost more than double the amount of troops we lost in those two theaters of action in just 6 weeks. So this is a stunning setback for the Russians. But don't count them out yet. They've gone back up to the north. They've remissioned, regrouped, refitted. They brought in reinforcements, reservists, and now they're moving. They're maneuvering down around the outside of the country, down to the east, an area called Donbass. Donbass is about 90% of Ukraine's resources, iron, coal, etc. The Russians want it. And there they have a sort of breakaway area, and they're putting all their tanks down there. And I think the tanks might be more effective down there than they were in these towns and villages up around Kiev. Because when the tanks went into these villages and towns, it mitigated some of their advantages. Villagers, citizens, volunteers were able to shoot at them with these missiles from the sides of houses and blow them up. So armor was negated in the fighting around Bucha or Irpin, these towns on the northwest and north of Kiev, or Brovary, where an iron column of tanks was wiped out on camera by the Ukrainians. So the tanks weren't very powerful in an urban setting, which is a key point in my article that you mentioned, Josh. But now the Russians have switched and put all their tanks down to the east in Donbass. And Donbass is different to these towns and villages around Kiev where the Russians were repulsed in the last 6 weeks. Donbass is more open, more flat. It is better tank territory. And this might give the Russians a fire and maneuver advantage over the Ukrainians who don't have many tanks. They're desperately begging for tanks, Ukrainians are. They want them to take on the Russians in almost like World War II style tank battles, like the Battle of Kursk, the biggest tank battle in history, which is fought up in Russia. And I think the Russians will have an easier time with logistics. The logistics were the real problem. Their tanks ran out of fuel. Their soldiers ran out of food. Morale was bad. The Russians have lost 7 generals. This is extraordinary. 7 other generals had to jump to the front to push the troops forward because morale was bad or leadership was bad. And the Ukrainians were able to pick off and kill 7 generals in 6 weeks of fighting. Once again, compare that to us. In our 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we lost just 1 general. And it wasn't in combat, it was assassination by an Afghan who tricked them. So they're being pummeled. They lost 15,000 of their troops, 7 generals, and according to NATO, about 20% of their force is either killed or depleted or wounded. So they've been really put back on their heels by this remarkable resistance and the leadership of Zelensky. Zelensky really is the hero of the day. I think the most famous quote of the entire war was the Americans offered to evacuate him and said, "You can't evacuate me. I don't want to leave my people behind. Give me ammo, not a ride home." Once again, compare this to the Afghan president who fled this summer. So meanwhile, all the Russians are now maneuvering and moving their forces down to the east for round 2, phase 2. They're going to try breaking out from the Donbass area and enveloping and encircling the lesser armored Ukrainians. There's a chance they could do this. And they're probably going to launch that campaign this very week. There's a lot of pressure on the Russians to succeed quickly. Vladimir Putin is egomaniacal. He wants to destroy Ukraine. He wants his legacy to be forever created by destroying Ukraine. And he wants it done by the date of May 9th. May 9th is a victory day for the Russians. This is the day when they defeated Nazis and forced them to sign a surrender. Dzień Pobiedy, the day of victory, in the Великая Отечественная война, the Great Fatherland War. The symbolism is important for Putin. He's pushing his generals hard, the ones we haven't killed, the Ukrainians haven't killed, and he wants a victory, a quick victory, to smash Ukrainians and envelop them in tank battles. The Ukrainians are begging. They said, "We want weapons, weapons, weapons." We've given them a lot. Once again, we've given them billions of dollars of weapons, much more than Reagan did to the rebels in Afghanistan in the 80s, especially the Stinger missiles and the Javelin anti-tank missiles, and a new missile called a Switchblade, which is amazing. And this is a little, almost like robot missile bazooka shell that flies around with a camera on it. And when you spot the enemy, you fly this kamikaze drone into his tank or his platoon, and you blow them up. But they want tanks. You need almost like heavy metal to win this war in the open area of the Donbass. A World War II style tank battle for the future of Ukraine is about to unfold. And I think it will happen this week because May 9th is coming up fast. That's the deadline for Putin, who wants to crush Ukrainians, and he still believes he can, and he still possibly could. The battle will change. And this is not advantageous to Ukrainians who've been so victorious so far, so steadfast, so amazing in their tactical defeat. The Battle of Kiev was won by platoon-sized units of Ukrainians, often volunteers, men, women fighting for their country. I read a story about a brave Ukrainian woman, typical Ukrainian woman, who got a Javelin anti-tank missile, drove to a site where she thought Russian tanks were coming, dug a little hole, and when the tanks drove by, she blew one up with her Javelin, ran away from return fire, and drove home in her car. I mean, that is the sort of resistance of the Ukrainians. It reminds me almost of the Chechens, a small nation of 1 million fighting against the transcontinental Russians in the 1994 to 96 Russian-Chechen War. And the Chechens, against all odds, won. Or against, in 1939, 1940, the Soviet Union invaded the neighboring country of Finland with a giant army, and the Finns zooming around on skis covered in white, waging guerrilla warfare, pushed back and crushed the Russians. They invented this thing called the Molotov Cocktail to honor Sergei Molotov, the Russian foreign minister, with these exploding bombs. So if a nation has the will to fight, as Ukrainian people do, it is tremendously important. Napoleon once said, morale gives you 3 extra soldiers to the enemies. If you have good morale, you have 3-to-1 advantage. Well, the Ukrainians are a nation at arms. Putin has united them like nothing ever before. A lot of people don't realize this, but Ukraine is actually almost 2 separate countries. In the East, you have Russians who have close ties to Russia. They speak Russian. In the West, you have Ukrainians. And over the years before this invasion, you had these elections where in some years they'd vote for a pro-West kind of pro-Ukrainian president, and other years they'd vote for a pro-East Russian president. So the country used to have a pendulum and go back and forth. But when Russia invaded in 2014, and now, especially when they've wiped out Kharkiv, this is the second largest city, and they've annihilated a city, Mariupol, of 500,000 people, and they've slaughtered tens of thousands of Ukrainians. And you see their bodies on TV every night. Babies, women who were burnt alive, cities that are massacred. They're having 9/11s every day. Al-Qaeda, not to minimize that sad day, I was there in 9/13 and saw the ruins of the World Trade Centers. It will never, ever leave me, that sad memory. But, that was a couple of buildings, big buildings. The Russians are annihilating not just buildings, but neighborhoods of buildings and whole cities of buildings. I don't know if you can actually call it genocide at the scale, according to the UN definition, but you can definitely call Putin a repeat person who engages in city-side annihilation of cities. This is a man who destroyed Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, and his people, the Russians, killed 300,000 people in teeny Chechnya, much more than Ukraine. Killed tens of thousands in Syria. So they're at it again, and in so doing, they have unified this once divided nation. They have forged a unified Ukraine like nobody else could. And Zelensky is almost like the founding father, the George Washington of this nation that has been forged in hatred to the Russians. So if Putin thought that he could march into Ukraine, overthrow his government, that it wasn't even a real country, they call them the little Russians, and they call it Novaya Rossiya, New Russia, a province of Russia. If he thought he could annihilate Ukrainian identity, and they want to erase the name Ukraine from the map. They published that newspaper last week. They want to ban the word Ukraine. If Putin thought he could erase a country, erase this identity, and smash it into slaves, and bring them into his country and dominate them the way he does in his dictatorship, well, he failed terribly. He unified his people like nothing else could, and they're fighting back like unimaginably. But they're up to the big battles now to come in the East. And I worry, because the Russians are also maneuvering on the south, along the south coast. For all the fact that they were stymied and lost the Battle of Kiev, which is amazing. I don't think anybody really saw that coming. And then they've been repulsed across the country. In the south, they're making inroads. They are trying to unite their forces in the south and then create a pincer movement and trap the Ukrainian army in a big tank battle and wipe them out. And then they want to move along the coast and capture Ukraine's largest port, a town called Odessa. Ukraine is the #1 wheat exporter on the planet. It has 1/3 of Europe's arable land. If they crush and capture the ports of Odessa, they can stop Ukraine from its main export and import of goods. It'll cause a huge problem for the world. Africa relies upon, the Middle East rely upon Ukrainian grain, and they'll bleed and make the Ukrainians starve. So that could still happen. I'm still worried about developments on the ground there. I'm glad though that Putin has also unified not just Ukraine, he's unified America. There was a lot of almost insidious pro-Putin support among certain factions in America in the last 4 or 5 years, which was frankly un-American, undemocratic. I don't know how this guy came to be adored as a strong man when he's actually a murderer of women and children, babies. That love of Trump, this butcher, as Biden called him, or the man that now Lindsey Graham has called Republican, has called for him on the throne, that love seems to be slowly fading out. And I watch Fox News in the evenings now, and they've now sort of returned to just calling out Putin as a war criminal. The sort of romance between him and Trump, between Putin and Trump, has ended. And it was most heartening for me to see when Zelensky spoke before both houses of Congress, Republicans and Democrats. They all stood and applauded for him. We haven't seen that sort of applause for a leader at war who was outgunned and being attacked by a dictator since the great Winston Churchill spoke to Congress. So not only has Putin unified the Ukrainians, half Russian and half Ukrainian, he's unified Democrats and Republicans in a time when nothing can unify us. So, I mean, when America is unified, as we are now, finally, we return back to our roots of defying Russia. We return to the roots of the great Ronald Reagan. This is the man who famously stood up to the Russians. He told Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He gave weapons to the Afghans to fight the Soviet invasion in the 80s. When you have the Republicans, the traditional party, who's always stood up to Russia, even candidate Mitt Romney in the debates, he correctly, in debates with Obama, said Russia is the real enemy. Obama mocked him, but he shouldn't have, because Mitt Romney was dead right. Russia was always going to be the lurking enemy, the real enemy. They attacked us last summer in a solar wind attack, attacked the Pentagon, attacked businesses, costing us millions of dollars. Russia is by far the greater enemy than China, which you hear about mainly on Fox News. So he's unified America, and he's unified NATO. Don't forget that NATO was sort of rudderless. Macron called it brain dead. Trump actually thought about pulling out, according to John Bolton, his national security advisor. And Trump was always angry with Angela Merkel, the head of Germany, which has the largest NATO force in Europe. I don't know why he was angry with her, but that is gone now. And we are back with NATO. And NATO was the strongest military alliance in history. We created it for our own defense. There was a sort of anti-NATO sentiment for the last 2 years. That's gone now. I think we correctly understand that every single country in NATO is like an aircraft carrier, like the USS Bulgaria, or the USS Romania, just like Japan is, the USS Japan for China, or the USS South Korea. We keep those aircraft carriers, those NATO countries, or Japan or Germany, afloat as a frontline defense for our country. And we now realize that NATO is not some socialist vampire sucking our blood, as it was defined for the last few years. They are our friends. They've always been there for us, and we're there for them. The cross-Atlantic, transatlantic, NATO-American brotherhood and friendship is alive again like never before. In fact, even Finland and Sweden, who are neutral, want to join NATO now. Defense budgets are going up in NATO. They're all unified in sending weapons to Ukrainians, more weapons than you can imagine. Blinken, the Secretary of State, said the other day, Ukrainians now have 10 anti-tank systems for every Russian tank. This is extraordinary. And it really took a lot of leadership from our government, from Biden, to get the alliance mobilized, to push people who are on the edge to come in and join us in this military alliance that has finally served its function. This is what NATO was created to do, to stop Russia from rolling in and smashing and annihilating democracies, which we created after World War II in Europe. And then, of course, we have the sanctions. The most important general we have in our army is a guy named Singh, a guy in charge of leveling the sanctions against Russia. They are extreme. And since we last talked, Josh, that was, I think, 12 days into the war. A lot has changed. A lot of lives have been lost, tragically. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians that were with us on that last interview are now dead, often buried in playgrounds or in basements or in mass graves. They're dead. Sadly, the Russian army has become a machine of massacre. They're all war criminals. And this is not some ad hoc decision by some local lieutenant on the grassroots level. This comes from the top. Putin has told them to terrorize and massacre the population. We saw a missile strike in a crowded train station just 2 days ago. A huge cluster bomb missile landed in the middle of a packed train station filled with men, women, and children, but mainly women and children, because the men were all fighting. And it killed 56 of them, I believe it was. And on the side of the missile, the Russians wrote "Za Deти," for the children, mocking them. So they know what they're doing. They're trying to terrorize and massacre the population and punish them, the center of gravity, the people, for resisting Russia. But the main thing that's hurting the Russians in return, in addition to all these surrogate defense systems, proxy war systems, asymmetric systems, like the Switchblade, this robotic drone missile, or the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, or the Javelin anti-tank missile, or even now the bigger S-300 giant tube-launched missiles, which can launch farther in the sky. The main thing that's hurting the Russians on a personal basis are these crippling sanctions. They far surpass anything the world has seen. They surpass what we did to Iran to sanction them with our sanctions for building nuclear weapons, or Iraq for invading Kuwait or building WMDs, or Darfur or Myanmar. The sanctions we've leveled against Russia are stunning. We've frozen hundreds of billions of dollars at their bank reserves overseas. We've frozen sanctioned their two main banks. They can't use MasterCards or a SWIFT system to transfer money. We've seized frozen the assets of all their oligarchs. These oligarchs can't even use their credit cards now. Imagine that, being a Russian billionaire, and you can't fly to your mansions, many mansions they have in London, their favorite town. They call it Londongrad, like Stalingrad or Leningrad. They can't travel abroad. And we've crippled the economy. The sanctions, it will say, will constrict the Russian economy by 15% this year. 15% of the economy will be crushed. Their economy has already gone from being number 11 in the world to number 22 in just a few weeks. They're going to go back to the Soviet era of living. They're going to default on their loans. And it's not just the US government and its allies. They're all freezing assets and putting these sanctions. It's private companies across the globe, Western private companies acting on their shareholders' demands, have yanked everything out of Russia. There's no more McDonald's, no more Starbucks, no more Boeing or Airbus, a European air company, which means that their jets, their fleets, which fly all over this giant country, 11 time zones, will be unable to fly in about a year because all the spare parts will end. In fact, it's almost going to be unsafe to fly a Boeing jet or an Airbus jet in the next few months because they're going to be unserviceable. And this affects the average Russians on many levels. The prices of everything has doubled. There's already been layoffs. The interest rates have skyrocketed. The Russian people are suffering for Putin's invasion, this murderous onslaught into neighboring Ukraine to destroy the so-called little Russians and bring them back into his rule. But sadly, many Russians support it. State TV is totally controlled by Putin. All they hear every day is that Ukrainians are Nazis, and that the Russians are liberating them from Nazism, which is ironic because, honestly, it's Putin who's acting like a modern-day Hitler. And the Russians seem to be, many levels, undiscerning. Nations buy into propaganda when it comes from their leadership. We were fed lies about WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, by our own government under George Bush Jr. in 2003. We launched this bloody war into Iraq, for no reason. It bogged us down into a quagmire. So if even Americans can be tricked by government propaganda in a country where we have open media and competing parties, imagine how much more so it is in Russia today. This totalitarian state where if you actually called a war in Ukraine, you called a war, you go to jail for 15 years. Putin has crushed his population into submission, and they're behind him. A recent poll said that 83% of Russians support the war. 83%. Now, you take that with a grain or a bucket of salt. This is almost like Mussolini-esque or Hitler-esque dictatorship. But still, a lot of people in Russia do support this war wholeheartedly. And you can't just separate the Russians from Putin. Those troops on the ground who are massacring people, shooting in the missiles, who are executing women, And they executed the mayor of a small town, and her husband and her 2 kids for refusing to cooperate with them. That was done by Russians on the ground there. There's a famous book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, about how Germans actually participated in the Holocaust, in killing of Jews. And they participated willingly in these wars across the globe to subdue Europe. In many ways, these Russians who were engaged in the war, and many supporting it and rallying behind Putin, they are Putin's willing executioners. It's not just Putin who has the blood of those people whose bodies they found in the mass graves in Bucha on their hands. It's not just Putin who has the bodies of those 300 people who were hiding beneath a theater in Mariupol when the Russians launched a giant missile on it and killed over 300, even though it said Diechi, children out front. And it is not just Putin who has the blood of the tens of thousands who've been smashed and blown up by these indiscriminate artillery strikes. That's how they're killing most people, by just unleashing random indiscriminate bombardments that have destroyed Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, wiped out Mariupol. Tens of thousands have been killed, maimed, wounded, and lie dead in the rubble of those cities. So the Ukrainians are up against a war of extermination. They're the frontline heroes. Zelensky is a true hero. He's really risen to the task. He really is the Ukrainian Churchill in many ways, unifying his people, being there, going to visit the troops, going to the front lines, going to the sites of these bloody, horrific massacres where women were raped and burnt alive. The pain in his eyes when he sees his people suffering and dying is obvious. He's become a hero around the world, and rightly so. Compare this guy to Putin, this egomaniac who's isolated, who has these dreams of murdering and conquering other people, who's arrested his own generals for giving him bad information when it was his war in the first place. So, I'm hopeful for the Ukrainians. The real battle, I think, for the future of Ukraine, for democracy in Ukraine, for them to have a chance to live free under the shadow of this bloody butcher, as Biden correctly called him, remains. That is the battle, the tank battle, in the flat, open plains of the Donbass. But I think the Ukrainians have that 3-1 advantage in morale. Women are out there fighting, men are fighting. The volunteerism is shocking, and that's why they're able to repulse the Russians. It is the will of the civilians to support the army, to support Zelensky, to support the troops, and to fight and die that are proving to be key thus far. I was on the phone with a Ukrainian the other day, and I said, what are you going to do when the war is over? And he corrected me with a powerful words. He said, don't say that, Brian. Don't say what I'm going to do when the war is over. Ask me what I'm going to do when we achieve a victory. And that is the real fighting spirit of the Ukrainians, who are the world's greatest heroes today. So I'll leave it on that note there. And Josh, I look forward to hearing questions from our wonderful alumni community and students.
Thank you, Professor Williams. Our first question is, what can be done to hold Putin accountable for reported war crimes?
Yeah, that is a hard question, and one that bothers me. You may remember in my last talk, I mentioned war crimes in the country of Bosnia. Bosnia was a country that was attacked similar to this from 1992 to 1995 by a mass murderer, a Serbian Orthodox ally of the Russians, actually, a guy named Slobodan Milosevic. I lived in Bosnia before that war. It was beautiful, it was gorgeous, beautiful mountains. It reminded me of Switzerland meets Turkey meets Greece. And to see those Serbs go in there and do mass rape camps, raping thousands of Bosnian Muslim women. And they massacred 7,000 Bosnian Muslim boys and men and old people in one day. And we went in there under NATO to stop this genocide under Bill Clinton. And we crushed the Serbians, and we ended up arresting Milosevic, the president, and trying him in the Hague, International Criminal Court, and sentencing him for life. That is the template, the model I would love to see in Russia after these massacres have come out, these horrible war crimes. I mean, I can't even tell you to the audience what they've done to the bodies and the women and children. These are sickening, grotesque crimes of war. This has nothing to do with the military ethos. You know, I worked in the military in Afghanistan, and I know how the soldiers worked there. You know, we demined minefields. We built wells to people. We built schools. We had one case of a soldier who did massacre some people, the only case in the war, and he was arrested and tried and sent to jail for life, that one guy. That is the military ethic, you know, the just war theory. That's how we fought in Afghanistan. What these troops have done is not warfare. It is murder. It is mass murder. It is a slaughter. And the people who did it need to be held accountable. The head of the European Union was there a couple of days ago and was disgusted. I see Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Britain, flew in yesterday in a sign of solidarity with Ukrainians. What has happened in the Bucha massacre and other towns, Irpin massacres, and much more people have been killed in Mariupol. You know, 5,000 people have been massacred in Mariupol. These are the biggest war crimes in Europe since Chechnya and since Bosnia, all carried out by either Russians or their allies, the Orthodox Russians loving Serbs. It is almost impossible, I'm afraid to say, to make Putin pay for this. You know, they're not on the International Criminal Court. They're thrown off the Human Rights Council by the UN, rightly so, just 2 days ago. They despise the International Criminal Court. They hate the idea of the Hague, which is where you try criminals, war criminals, existing at all. It would take them cooperating with us to extradite the general. We know the general's name, who's in charge of these executions in Bucha, which were so sickening. We know the general's name, who killed 5,000 people in Mariupol, the most destroyed city on the planet. We know their names. We know Putin's name. But, you know, it'll be impossible, I think, for us to ever hold them accountable because they're not cooperating with the UN. And, you know, we can't get in there and get these guys. You know, the best we can do is hope that the Ukrainians capture some of them and send them to the Hague for trials for crimes against humanity.
Thank you. We had a few questions that came in the communications leading up to this Corsair chat. There was a picture of you next to a helicopter. Would you like to share the story behind that picture?
Yes. You may recall, I think if you're watching the news closely, about a week ago, the Ukrainians did something extraordinary. They launched a helicopter gunship raid from their country through Russian-controlled airspace, about 42 kilometers into Russia itself. And these helicopters carrying missiles dove down onto the largest oil reserve for Russian troops going into Ukraine, and they blew it up on camera. There's amazing footage of these two Ukrainian brave pilots flying through Russian airspace and coming back alive. The helicopters they were flying in that bold mission to go into Russia were a Russian Soviet-built helicopter called the Mil-24 Hind. If anybody saw Rambo 3, a movie that came out in the 80s with Sylvester Stallone, he goes up against one of these giant armored behemoths, like a flying tank. So it was for many decades the most advanced helicopter gunship in the Russian and Soviet and now Ukrainian arsenal. The Russians, Soviets also used these giant helicopters with the missiles and a Gatling machine gun on the front. So you can see my picture to slaughter Afghans during the invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s. But during Operation Cyclone, Ronald Reagan famously shipped hundreds and hundreds of these anti-aircraft Stinger missiles to the Ukrainian, to the Afghan rebels called the Mujahideen in the 80s. And these Muslim Afghan rebels were then able to shoot these advanced state-of-the-art copters out of the skies. In my travels in Afghanistan, I remember seeing several of these giant Russian-built Hind attack helicopters lying in the desert where they got blown up and shot out of the sky in the 80s with American missiles.
Thanks. And Ryan posted a link to the picture for anyone who maybe not have seen it so you can see what the helicopter looks like. We have a question that's asking about the difference between tactics of the U.S. military and Russian army in the fact that Russian tactics seem to rely on quantity of people without care for loss of soldier lives. Can you speak to the difference?
Yeah, and that really is a superb military tactical question. And the questioner is dead right. There's a lot of problems with the Russian army. Before this invasion, we thought they were 12 foot tall. We thought they'd smash and cream the Ukrainians. This is the army we've been preparing to fight in defense of NATO ever since NATO was created in the 40s. But yeah, they have a different command and control structure. We have these things called NCOs, non-commissioned officers, lower ranked leaders in the army, below the rank of corporal, and they are taught to act autonomously, to think on their feet, to create their own rules, to maneuver and respond to situations. In my time spent in Afghanistan with the troops, you saw lieutenants, platoon leaders acting like generals because they have the autonomy to do so. And that is one of the geniuses of the American military and NATO militaries. And that's one of the things we taught the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians got defeated in 2014 when Putin surprised the world and ambushed them and invaded and conquered Ukraine, province of Crimea, and the Donbass on the east. So NATO and Americans, Green Berets, Special Forces went in and trained Ukrainians to think like we do, to maneuver autonomously down to the platoon level. Forget the battalion level. Of course, they operate autonomously too. This gives us flexibility. And that tactical flexibility is something the Ukrainians, including the Air Force, as opposed to the rigid Russian Air Force, has exploited magnificently against the rigid hierarchy of the Russians. But basically, one man's controlling this war, and he's not on the battlefront. That is Vladimir Putin sitting up there in Moscow, 500 miles from the theater of action. They didn't even have a general in the field until just today. They pointed a guy who killed millions of people, thousands of people in Syria, Doroshenko, to be the field commander for the army. So everything goes up the chain of command. There is no flexibility, no sort of spontaneous maneuver capacity like we have in our army. And that's how we're able to conquer Iraq in just 3 weeks and Afghanistan in 2 months when the Russians can't. I think a lot of that is just that built-in ability to think for yourself that non-commissioned officers have in America Army as opposed to the Russians. And that's why we had these 7 generals. 7 Russian generals killed since the war began, because they need to go down there and tell the troops what to do, put themselves in harm's way, and they're being picked off and killed. So excellent question. And I'm glad the questioner brought that up, because I think it explains to a huge extent why the Russians can't maneuver more flexibly the way we would, or the way the Ukrainians have.
Thank you. Can you speak to Ukraine's effective use of drones in defeating the Soviets to date?
That is a remarkable story. The Russians went in expecting to get air supremacy, air superiority, which is less, but they wanted to have total dominance of the skies, just as we did in, say, Iraq or in Afghanistan. So our aircraft could supply our troops on the ground with air artillery, which means on the spot overwatch, close air support, calling bomb strikes by laser guided munitions or satellite guided munitions, instantaneous reaction to suppress enemy fire. That is how we maneuvered and conquered Mosul, a city of 2 million people, back in 2014, 15. And that is how we operated and overthrew the Taliban. The Russians never achieved this. Their planes were shot out of the sky with these stingers. Russian MiGs were shot down by Ukrainian MiGs, and they never gained dominance or supremacy. And in fact, what's ironic, to answer your questioner's question, it is Ukrainians who've been so masterful at using drones. They use them in 3 ways. One is the use of a 20-foot Turkish manufactured drone, which is like a small Predator, or smaller than a Reaper, of course, our drones. And it fires laser-guided missiles. It's become the hero of the Ukrainians. They wrote a pop song about the Bayraktar, the drone, the Turkish Bayraktar drone that made it in the airways there. They love this drone because it keeps filming its attacks on the Russians. In a recent attack by a Bayraktar drone, it flew over a Russian squadron of airplanes in a place called Kherson and blew them up, and blew up tanks and things with a drone remotely. So it was amazing footage. Drones have been filmed by Ukrainians blowing up tanks. So that they've been used in a tank killing capacity, shooting these armor penetration laser guided missiles from the Bayraktar, but also smaller drones have been used. We've seen the Ukrainians skillfully use drones to guide mortar to pre-vectored zones. The Russians come in and the drones monitoring and giving real-time intelligence to a mortar team, which then blows it up to guide artillery and even to guide ambushes. But I think the most spectacular use of these small drones was back in the early days of the war. Recall, if you will, that a massive giant column, 40 miles long, of Russian troops came pouring into Ukraine from the neighboring country of Belarus. But they got halted, they got stopped. It became almost like this parking lot of targeted vehicles. What stopped it? Turns out a very ingenious small team of Ukrainians who'd gone on GoFundMe and purchased these drones online, these little online Amazon delivered quadraptor, little teeny propeller drones that could drop hand grenades. And they spied on the Russians from the forest on their own little bicycles and things, and called in some grenade strikes that blew up some of the tanks at the beginning of the column and stopped it. They got clogged behind the blown up tanks. And a small unit that funded themselves on GoFundMe. I'd love to send funds to those guys. They bought their own drones and dropped hand grenades down on this giant column, 40 miles of armor. And these kids, these IT tech kids operating in the forest of northern Ukraine, stymied, blocked, and halted that giant column of tanks that was aiming for Kiev. So the Ukrainians are teaching the world one thing: asymmetric use of drones can really mitigate armor, fire maneuver capacity of a modern army, and it gives guerrillas a real chance to fight back, which is a lesson I hope the U.S. military learns, because our tanks, our M81 Abrams tanks, it's probably the best tank in the world. We used them effectively in a city called Fallujah in Iraq in 2004 against Zarqawi's insurgents. And on several occasions, those M1 tanks, Abrams tanks, received direct hits by insurgent-fired RPG rocket-propelled grenades, and they survived. But these new drones drop anti-tank munitions, and they can knock out tanks. Tanks aren't quite the battlefield-dominant system now that they were before this era of drone warfare and the era of Javelin and NLAW and Panzerfaust German anti-tank weapons.
Professor, have you heard anything about life in currently Russian-occupied Ukraine?
Terrible things. Oh, we've seen the horrors. They've occupied 10% of Ukraine, and it is horrific. We've seen them on camera kidnapping the mayor of a southern town with special forces, putting a bag over his head and kidnapping him to make him do their will. They executed the mayor, this woman mayor, of a small village north of Kiev, and her whole family. They've engaged in systematic rape. This happened before in Chechnya, when the Russians poured into this teeny country called Chechnya, a republic in their federation that broke away. I wrote a book about it called Inferno in Chechnya. And I heard a lot of stories from the Chechens about the Russians' use of rape as a weapon to terrify, intimidate, and humiliate Chechens. And oftentimes they murder their rape victims and burn their bodies, mutilate them. Sorry to be so honest, but that's what we're seeing in towns like Bucha and Irpin. We're going to see it on a much larger scale when they finally pull out of Kharkiv. So it is a dark world. The Russians came in claiming to be liberators, to liberate Ukrainians. They call themselves peacekeeping troops. But they lied to themselves that they're freeing the country from Nazis, but they're terrorizing the population. Once again, compare this to our actions in Iraq and Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan and we built democracy. 1/3 of the Afghan parliament was made up of women. We built skyscrapers, built a government. The highways, I traveled all over Afghanistan in my years going there and working for the military or the CIA or doing my own books, like The Last Warlord, which I researched there. The roads in Afghanistan are better than the ones in Boston where I live, much better. We built schools. We increased the life expectancy, increased the GNP, the gross national product. Women were given educations. We really were liberators. We brought democracy to Iraq too. That was a bad war, and that it was based on false pretenses, these so-called WMDs. But at least we brought democracy there. These Russians are there to abort and destroy democracy, to take away people's freedom. And the more they get defeated on the battlefield, as I predicted in my last talk, the more they will kill tens of thousands of Ukrainians and make the women, the grandmothers, the grandfathers, the babies, the children, They burned a maternity ward. They bombed a maternity ward. They filmed a pregnant woman being dragged out of a burning maternity ward, and she and her baby later died. So these are murderers, almost like villains from a Mad Max movie, going into the country, annihilating everything. So to answer the questioner's question, you don't want to be living under Russian occupation. You spend your life living in your cell, your bunker, not leaving your house. I saw a horrible image last week of a Ukrainian girl walking her bicycle down the street, and she turns the corner, and there's a big Russian tank there. And the tank sees her and shoots an artillery shell into her and blows her to pieces. That little girl is the face of Ukrainians living today under Russians' quote unquote liberation.
Professor, you had mentioned your last book, The Last Warlord, which I highly recommend everyone pick up and give a read. Could you explain how the Afghan army was defeated so easily, but the Ukrainians are defying a much larger army?
Yeah, that is a question that has vexed me, and I think a lot of people actually thought that question. You mentioned my book, The Last Warlord. I was actually hoping to give a talk on that. My wonderful dean, Pauline Tin, set up for me in the fall. But the Taliban swept through Afghanistan and conquered it in 3 weeks of fighting in August of last year. And they captured the marshal, the general in charge of the Afghan Army's house, his compound. And they found my book there, translated into Persian, Dari, local language. And they mocked my book. They banned it. Anybody reading my book to be killed. And they, of course, banned me. I can't travel to Afghanistan anymore. They'll kill me. Almost like Salman Rushdie, who was banned by Ayatollah Khomeini in the 80s for his book, Satanic Verses. So sadly, we had to cancel my talk because there's fears for our safety of our students and the community with a death threat out against me. Yeah, I'm deeply invested in Afghanistan. A magnificent country. When I traveled there, it didn't feel like I was traveling to another country. It felt like I was going in a time machine to another era. It wasn't medieval. It was almost Abrahamic, Old Testament, Abraham. When you got there, you'd see nomadic tribes who never had electricity, people living in tents, castles that Alexander the Great attacked. And it was a very ancient, almost archaic country. I actually can't even call it a country. In my classes at UMass Dartmouth, my history class in Afghanistan, on the war there, I call it Game of Thronesistan. Because there really is this almost vortex of 4 quarreling Game of Thrones style tribes, always jostling and jockeying for power. They never had modernity. They never were colonized by a modern European power, like say, the British in India or the French in Algeria. It wasn't modernized. It is the land that time forgot. And you have these Mongol tribes in the north, descended from Genghis Khan, or my people. I speak their language. Turkish Uzbek, and they fight with the Aryan Pashtuns. They're the main group. You may have seen that National Geographic photograph with the girl with the little green eyes, very haunting picture. She's an Aryan Pashtun, the main group. They call them Afghans too. And the Afghans conquered the Mongols. The Aryan Afghans conquered the Mongols and conquered the Persian Tajiks and a Shiite group, and created this sort of medieval kingdom. And then we invade in 2001, or liberated in 2001, more rightly. And we try sort of transitioning from counterterrorism to counterinsurgency to stop the Taliban from coming back, to nation building. And we did our damnedest. That nation building project in Afghanistan was the most expensive overseas investment in American history, more expensive than rebuilding post-World War II Europe. After all that destruction in the Marshall Plan, we built Germany and Holland, etc. It was the most expensive thing we've ever done abroad. It cost over $2 trillion. We built an Afghan army to the tune of 86 billion. And we took these tribesmen who were literate from the different competing ethnic groups, trained them in modern warfare to fight for something they didn't know about, called a transcendent overarching nation. Not just tribe, but a nation. And we equipped them. We spent 20 years training them with special forces. We flew them to America for training. We built up an air force for them. Almost like $86 billion. Let's compare that to Ukraine. We spent $2.3 billion in Ukraine on the Biden administration. Although that's not as much as it might seem, because we spent $9 billion a month fighting in Iraq in that quagmire. But that whole edifice, the whole Afghan army we built was weirdly dependent upon Americans. I wrote the U.S. Army's field manual for Afghanistan. I published it as a civilian version as Afghanistan Declassified. And in it, I warned U.S. troops while serving alongside in my base to be aware of a phenomenon I called the Afghan rolling defection snowball effect. Afghans are always doing this. Which way is the wind blowing? Who's strongest? It's a very unstable neighborhood. And you want to be on the winning side, to jump ship and join the winners, to defect. And they have this remarkable culture of defection, of betraying a side you're on to jump on the other side to be on the winning side. And as soon as, I think Trump began drawing down the troops and he wanted to pull out in the last year of his presidency, the Pentagon pushed back, thankfully, and stopped him. I was against the troop withdrawal under Trump, and they pushed it back to May of last year. In walks Biden, almost like into an IED, a landmine set by Trump. And he agrees with Trump to pull this 2,000 U.S. troops out from the Afghan theater of war. Mind you, these 2,000 troops weren't the cutting edge of the war. They were just force multipliers, accelerants. They called in drone strikes. They used satellites, and they gave support to the Afghan Army, which we trained. There was no reason to pull them out. But Trump and Biden both agreed, and Biden famously pulled them out in August. We lost 13,000 soldiers in an ISIS attack, and we got out. But when we pulled out, we signaled to the Afghan people, to the Afghan soldiers, that we no longer had their back. And they were so prone to defection, so wishy-washy, especially the main tribe, the Pashtuns, who always defected. And for months, they began defecting, and generals preparing to surrender and give up their troops and weapons. And, it was the exact opposite of what we see in Ukraine today. Ukraine and Afghanistan are basically the same size, similar populations, but Ukrainian women are fighting back, which you can't do in Afghanistan. They're misogynistic. Women can't fight in the army, really. A few of them did, but a few hundred. Civilians, citizens, they want freedom in Ukraine. They had the morale to fight for their country the same way the Finns did against the Soviets and repulsed them in 1939-40. Same way the Chechens did in 94-96. The willpower to fight is strong amongst Ukrainians. They're a modern, unified nation. They believe in their identity, and they're willing to fight and die as a united nation against a common foe. That is something, sadly, the Afghans didn't have, and they lost it. Their president ran away in a helicopter. Their army defected en masse, gave their weapons to the Taliban. And you see these remarkable images of Taliban flying U.S. Black Hawk helicopters that the Afghan army gave them, driving our Humvee armored personnel carriers. Army was surrendering towns like Mazar Sharif, a town I used to live in the north, without a fight. So you compare the Afghans and their cultural defection with the will to fight of the Ukrainians. And that is the main deciding difference. We have a lot more opportunity to the Afghans to fight. $86 billion of weapons to fight against 80,000 Taliban, whereas the Ukrainians are fighting against 150,000 Russians armed with an air force, a navy bombarding them from the shores, tanks. Ukrainians are up against a lot more than these tribal Pashtun Taliban were. So the Afghans should have easily smashed the Afghan Taliban army. The Afghan army should have won, but they didn't have the fighting spirit, and they had no Zelensky. The Ukrainian President Zelensky is really a unifier of his nation in the way Ashraf Ghani, the Afghan president, sadly never could be.
Thank you. I know we're at the end of the chat, so I'd like to ask, where do you see this going next? I know we talked about, geez, it seems like yesterday, but a few weeks ago, and I know you successfully made a lot of predictions of where this would be. How do you see this going, and what do you think are the next steps?
I think there is a lot of false optimism in the West, European Union, Americans. That's because we think this is a bloodbath. It's not good for Russia. If the Russians have lost 15,000 troops, that's a massacre. If they have lost over 240 tanks, that's a defeat on a level America could never imagine. Their economy is tanking. It's going to be catastrophic for the average Russians. You would think it is in Russia's interest to end this war that has been a catastrophe, a strategic catastrophe, a tactical catastrophe, an economic catastrophe. Russia is isolated like never in history. It is blown up in Putin's face. You would think that we could all moderate with him, come to an understanding, and give him a face-saving and troop-saving off-ramp. Say to him, for example, okay, fine. You annexed Crimea in 2014, keep it. And you annexed half of Donetsk, Luhansk and Donetsk in the Donbass region in the east, keep those. Just take your murderous, pillaging, marauding slaughterers out of this democracy and go home and declare victory. You would think that's what we could offer him. But this is a man who really, he stuck America in the eye. He defeated our CIA-backed troops in Syria. When Trump yanked our troops out of north there, his troops in northern Syria, when Trump yanked them out in October of 2019 and gave Trump an own goal and gave the Russians our bases, he mocked us. He mocked us for pulling out of Afghanistan. He thinks he mocked us by attacking SolarWinds, a cyber attack, the biggest cyber attack in American history. He wants to mock and destroy American dominance in Europe. He wants to destroy democracy. He's a maximalist. He's won every war. He invaded Georgia in 2008 under Bush and won. His troops smashed all opposition in Syria and kept another bloody dictator, Assad, in power in Syria. He stole Crimea and Donbass in 2014. He needs a Ukraine victory to seal his legacy, and he needs it by May 9th, the Soviet victory over Nazi Day. So I see in the next month a lot of tragedy. Sadly, a lot more Ukrainian deaths, a lot more Russian conscripts who don't want to be there. They're invading other people's country and morale is low. A lot more Russian deaths, a lot more citizen Ukrainian soldiers who are out bravely fighting for their homeland to give their kids a chance at democracy. I see them dying. And I see one man, the man who's pulling all the strings for all this murder and death and mayhem, pushing forward. And if he is repulsed in the next month, keeping on a grinding, bloodbath, long-distance war of attrition, long-term war of attrition that may go on, sadly, not for months, but potentially for years, like we saw in Syria. So I pray for the Ukrainians, and even for the Russians, who are suffering from this madman's delusions, his dream of reconstituting Russian power in Eurasia. I hope for their sake that my sad, gloomy prediction doesn't come true, and that we do get armor and firepower to the Ukrainians quickly, so they do stop the thrust, the invasion, the attack coming from Donbass this week, next week at the latest. A massive offensive will be launched to try and envelop Ukrainian troops. They may yet defeat Ukrainians who are outclassed and outgunned when it comes to tanks, and especially with artillery. Artillery is the god of war. So you could see a massive tactical and strategic defeat for the Ukrainians in the east. But I have hope for them. If Ukrainians are like our football team, the Corsairs, and they're up against the mighty New England Patriots, I hope they pull off another miracle and they stand strong and that they defend their democracy and their nation and they achieve the victory that my Ukrainian friends told me, always ask for. Don't ask for what to do when the war's over, but ask what's going to happen when we achieve victory. So I hope that is the outcome. And I pray for them. I really do. I see this as a black and white struggle of a freedom-loving people against everything America should hate. And now it seems we're all united against it finally. And I think with US support and continuing sanctions and their determination, they will eventually win this war in the long run. You can't crush a people who's that united, that willing to fight, and that well supported by the world's greatest superpower, the USA, and the greatest alliance in the world's history, NATO. So ultimately, I think Ukraine will prevail, but we have hard days ahead of us, especially in the next few weeks. And so thank you again for the questions and for this opportunity to share the story of the Ukrainians who've so inspired me and so inspired the world. Zelensky is a hero for all of us. He's a shoo-in for Time Man of the Year. This Ukrainian George Washington. So thank you for giving me the chance to share the story. I get a little passionate about it, so I'm sorry about that, but I feel for the people there. I really truly do. And I also am so grateful for, once again, for you and Ryan Meryl and Dean Hickey, and my Dean, Pauline Nancy, and my chairman, Mark Santo, and all the people in the community out there who care enough to take some time out from their lives in our own safe world, where the biggest problem might be, poor internet service or a hot cappuccino from Starbucks, and to care about people whose country is being annihilated. I think over 7 million Ukrainians have now fled for their lives out of a population of 40 million. And let's pray for them, hope that they do come through. And many thanks again for this humbling opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Williams, your passion, expertise. We can't thank you enough, and I'm sure we'll be doing this again, and we appreciate your willingness to help and share. I would like to point out again to please in the chat check out Professor Williams and former history alum Aaron Raleigh's essay, Has Putin Heeded the Warnings from History of Urban Warfare? That's on the top of the chat. Definitely please give that a look. And thank you everyone for spending time with us today on a Sunday as we continue to try to bring you up-to-date information. And we really appreciate it, and everyone stay safe. Thanks again, Professor Williams.
Thank you.